Well, it's great to welcome you back as we are continuing our studies of the Greek of the New Testament. We're working our way through the textbook, a classic textbook written by J. Gresham Machen back around the turn of the century. I hope you're finding it useful, and I hope that these online discussions are also of use to you. We're coming this time together to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is a fairly short chapter, and I think a relatively easy chapter, so you're going to find this a little bit of a break, I think. It does, however, introduce a very important new idea that we want to make sure we have under control. We have been moving, of course, now with chapter 10 to a discussion of verbs. We've essentially covered the basics of how nouns are declined and so on. We'll be doing more with nouns, of course, as we go along, but right now we have the basics of the first, second, and the first, second declension. We'll actually come to the third declension somewhat later. But with verbs, of course, we have a fair amount of information we need to master. First of all, we have active voice and passive voice. And in chapter 10, you recall, we were actually distinguishing those two. The passive and middle voice actually are conjugated the same way. Now we're coming to what's called the imperfect. The imperfect is a peculiar Greek tense that refers to past time, but is especially focused on past time with respect to progressive action. And so I might say to you, for example, I walked to the store yesterday, and that in Greek would actually be the so-called aorist tense. We'll be saving that for a future discussion. However, if I were to say to you, I was walking to the store yesterday, as if to imply in the process of conducting that action, something else possibly took place. As I was walking to the store, for example, I bumped into a tree, that kind of thing. Well, when we have the past action described as ongoing or progressive, then the Greek tense that is used in that case is the imperfect. And that's what we're coming to in this particular lesson. So we're going to be dealing with the imperfect, active, indicative. We'll save the middle imperfect and the past, or the passive rather, for a future discussion. So right now we're just introducing this new idea, and as you can probably guess, the way that we recognize the imperfect tense as we're reading the Greek New Testament is once again by the endings. But there is another little detail that is added to the Greek verb at this point that we need to understand, and this is called the augment. So Machen gives a good discussion of that in this chapter, but let me just try to explain it briefly at this point as well. When the action referred to is in the past tense, that is referring to something that took place in the past, and this could be the past tense, the imperfect tense, and so on. Anytime you're referring to that, it's called a secondary tense. Secondary is referring to action that takes place in history, behind me, in prior time. And ordinarily, when that is the case, then the Greek verb will be augmented. Now, the simple augment simply involves taking the epsilon and attaching it immediately to the beginning of the verb. So, for example, I have the verb blepo, the one that we learned in our first vocabulary list. Well, if I'm going to put this in the imperfect tense, I'm simply going to put an epsilon right at the beginning, and it'll be eblepon. You see, eblepon, and that epsilon is called an augment. Now, if the word already begins with a vowel, for example, the word akuo, then we don't put an epsilon before the alpha, so it'd be like akuo or something, but we simply take that vowel and lengthen it. The most common way you'll find that is that an alpha as well as an epsilon will be lengthened to an eta. And so that's what you want to notice, and we'll see that taking place in this chapter on occasion. The other thing to notice is that if the vowel that you're dealing with happens to be a compound, that is, it has a preposition affixed to the beginning of the verb, then instead of augmenting the first letter of the preposition, you actually slide the augment in between the preposition and the verb itself. So, for example, if we have the verb ekbalo, which Machen mentions in this chapter, then rather than making it ekbalo, lengthening that initial epsilon, we take the epsilon and slide it in there after the ek, but before the balo. So it becomes ekabalo, but then, as is customarily the case, the kappa there is going to become a separate letter that is a little easier to pronounce. In this case, it'll become a gazi, so it's going to be exabalo, you see, or to use actually the proper imperfect ending, exabalon. But then, because the recessive rule pushes the accent back into the verb as far as it can go, it's going to be exebalon, and you'll see how that works out in the chapter. So the endings are pretty straightforward. Using the paradigm from Luo, it's going to be eluon, elus, elua, eluomen, eluata, eluon. You notice the first and second person plural, actually the endings are identical to the present. The only ones that are changing are in the first person and in the third person plural. You'll also notice that the eluon of the first person singular and the eluon of the third person plural are identical, which can indeed sometimes create a bit of an ambiguity, but you'll find that generally speaking the context makes it pretty clear which is implied, the first person singular or the third person plural, so that normally doesn't turn out to be a real big problem. The only other little detail in this chapter to make a note of is that we are also going to be introduced to the imperfect of the word me. So we a me, I am. If I wanted to say rather I was, then the imperfect of that is provided for us as well. Amain, ace, ain, and then amen, eta, and asan. So you'll notice the conjugation of that in the chapter, and that's pretty much it. This chapter, as I say, is fairly short, and I think you'll find it reasonably straightforward to work through it. I'm going to go through the vocabulary list with you at this point, make a few more comments, and then we'll do some of the exercises, and I'll turn you loose to work on the rest of the exercises on your own. So let's take a look at the vocabulary list now. The vocabulary list gives us some fairly important words. These are words you'll certainly want to, again, master, memorize. The first one is the word iro, which means either I take up or I take away. And again, the context is going to help us understand which meaning is in place. Sometimes it gives rise to an ambiguity. In the text, for example, in the New Testament, where Jesus is talking, this is in the upper room discourse of John's Gospel, and he says, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, I take up or take away. You recall that text? It's not real clear. This is the verb that's being used there, and it gives rise to two different meanings. Maybe what Jesus means there is I take them away, as in dispose of them, or maybe what it means is I take up, as in lifting them up and hanging them on a trellis or something like that so that they can bear more fruit. There's a bit of a conversation going on to this day as to the meaning of that. I'll leave that for another time, but this is the word iro, I take up or I take away. The next word is anabino. This word bino is actually a word that means go, but doesn't occur in the New Testament as such, but it does occur in combinations with other words. The preposition ana means up and related ideas, so you'll notice this is in fact a compound verb. Ana, bino, and taken together it means I go up. If we were going to put this in the imperfect, then recall what we're going to do is get rid of the alpha and replace it with an epsilon. So it's going to be anebinon if we put this in the imperfect. We'll see that a little bit more later, but just get the basic verb now. The next word we have is apothnesko. This means I die. Once again, it's a compound, the apa from the word from, and the thnesko from an ancient Greek root we won't worry about. But taken together, the simple meaning of the word is I die. Again, if we're going to put it in the imperfect, we would get rid of this omicron right there and replace it with an epsilon. Again, we have apokteno. This is the word that means I kill. Once again, it's a compound verb, and so to augment, we're going to see the junction right there, and we're going to put the epsilon there, so it'd be epektenon if we're using the imperfect. Apostello is a word that means send. You know the word apostle, which literally is someone who is sent. That's the noun form of this very same word. Apostello is a compound verb. We have apa here, from, and stello is a word that means send, to take together, to send, but it usually implies sending on some kind of particular mission, or sending with a commission, or sending in some sense with a special responsibility, as opposed to stello, which can just mean to send, as in send away, or some such thing. Artos is the word for bread. It could mean a piece of bread, or it can mean bread in a kind of generic sense. It's the common word in the New Testament that means and is translated bread. It's a masculine noun, second declension, regular in that sense. Bino, the word that means go. We've talked about that already. Estheo, the word for eat. And so estheo is used often in the New Testament, both metaphorically and literally, to eat. It's just the standard word for that. Kata is a word that has quite a few different meanings in the New Testament, and it's frequently used in connection with other words. For example, katabino, you see it right here. Kata, in and of itself, can mean, when it's simply standing alone, for example, with the genitive, is going to mean against. The genitive tends to stand for separation, so that's how you think of that, whereas with the accusative, it kind of it suggests more a moving together in the accusative case, so it's going to be according to. And the word kata also can simply mean down, and is often used in combination with other verbs with that sense. Katabino, for example, then means I go down, as opposed to anabino that we saw earlier, that means I go up. The next word we have is actually this combination of words, men, de. Men is used in combination with de to mean something like the English idiom, on the one hand, on the other. On the one hand, I said A to Alan, but on the other hand, I said B to Ben. You know, that idea, where we're making a kind of a contrast between two ideas, on the one hand, on the other. However, in English, you'll notice that that is rather cumbersome, and we don't use that expression all that frequently. It's when we really want to emphasize the notion of on the one hand and on the other, whereas you'll notice in the Greek New Testament, this particular combination is used quite frequently. And sometimes it's just too cumbersome to try to translate it literally, on the one hand, on the other. You can see that in Greek these are very short one-syllable words, and they're simply setting up a kind of mild contrast between two ideas. So as you're reading the New Testament, you'll notice that, but as you're translating it, you may or may not want to incorporate that entire English phrase, on the one hand, on the other, into your English translation. You just have to let kind of the stylistic considerations dictate your decision. This particular word, you can tell immediately, is a combination of two words, uk, eti. We know the word uk is not, we know the word eti is yet, and so we might on the face of it think the word means not yet. But in fact, there is a separate word in Greek for not yet, and this word actually means something closer to the English word no longer. No longer am I going to stay in this house, that sort of thing. So you'll just have to keep that in mind. Don't be tempted to give the translation that seems to suggest itself to you when you first see it, but realize that the word actually has a somewhat distinct idea. No longer, the word uketi. Para, I think you recognize immediately that in English we have many words that use this word para. When I used to practice law, I had paralegals that worked for me, people that work alongside a lawyer. You know the other words, paramedic, and so on. Parabola is even a word that uses this prefix, and so on. It's used in many, many different words. There's also, of course, the Greek cognate word that you probably know, paraclete, Greek word parakletos, one who is called in alongside. The basic meaning of para is to simply be beside something. With the genitive, it's going to possibly mean from, somewhat synonymous to apo. With the dative, it can mean beside. with the accusative alongside of, many times implying some kind of motion. Beyond that, you just have to keep your eye on it. The context will help you sometimes, but the fundamental idea in all of those, regardless of the case that's being associated with it, is that something is beside or alongside of the object that is in mind. Here's a good example of the word para used in combination with the verb. We already know lambano, I take or I receive. Paralambano would be the same idea, I receive, and it also implies a separate notion of I take along. I can take someone along with me. I might use the word paralambano in that case. Sun is a word that means with, but it means with in the sense of together with. It's the kind of word that you would use typically if you were together with someone or together with a group of people in a room. Then sun would be more the word that you would use, whereas meta means beside or with in that sense. Para means alongside of, beside in that sense. So we actually have three words now in Greek that have all come to suggest some notion of being with something else, but each one has a kind of subtle distinction with respect to it. A very common word in the New Testament that uses sun in combination with another word is synago. We're going to learn eventually the word synagoge, which is a synagogue and is based on this verb. Synago simply means literally to lead together, and then ordinarily would be rendered more something like to gather together. Obviously, a synagogue is a place where people gather together, and it's taken straight from this word, synago, to lead together or to gather together in that sense. Tote, the word for then, it's an adverb. It never comes in any other form than that one, and so that's easy to remember. And so those are the words that we have in this vocabulary list. They're good words. They're words that you will see frequently in the New Testament. And certainly, once again, my counsel to you is to take the time to really develop some mastery of them as you're going along. And you'll find that your efforts in doing so will be very much worth it. Just to comment briefly on the new conjugation that we get in this chapter. This, of course, is given to you by Machen in the chapter, but I just wanted to comment on it briefly. Again, we have eluon. You'll notice that we're adding the epsilon at the beginning, which, as I mentioned earlier, is called an augment. If the word began with a vowel, for example, a kuo, then that is lengthened to an eta. You see that, of course, explained by Machen in the chapter, but ordinarily, if the verb begins with a consonant, then we just put the epsilon there at the beginning. And then, of course, the rules of verb accent indicate that we want to have the accent recede as far into the verb as possible. We have here a three-syllable verb, and so the accent wants to recede as far as possible and actually goes clear back to the epsilon. So even though the verb is luo, in the first person singular imperfect, it's eluon. Similarly here, elues, here, elua, or the movable nu if the next word begins with a vowel. Here, of course, the same principle applies, but because we have a two-syllable ending, the verb can only go back here to the antepenult, so it's eluomen, eluita, and then eluon. And again, we noted that the ending is identical between these two, the first person singular and the third person plural. The context is going to help you determine which one of those applies in any given setting. Another word that's given to us in this chapter is one we've already had. This is the word eimi, I am. This, however, is the imperfect. So, amen, I was. Ace, singular, thou wast. If we're going to speak, King James English, you or he was would be the third person here. Amen, eta, asan. This is, of course, just an absolutely ubiquitous word in the New Testament. I suppose it shows up on every page of the New Testament in some form or other. So just take the time to learn it. It's definitely worth your while to memorize that and just be able to tick it off without any particular deep thought. Amen, ace, ain, amen, eta, asan. So just wanted to mention that. Of course, you notice that the accenting of this is absolutely according to our expectation. Over here, this is a short ultima, and you know that a long accented penult must have the circumflex, so that applies here. The alpha here is short, so once again we have the circumflex here. This is a long ultima, so the accent has to be an acute. Lilac pen, last is long, acute on the penult. These, however, are circumflex, one-syllable verbs, so just make a note of the accenting as you go along as well. All right, so I think we're ready to take a look at the exercises. I'm going to give you the first 3 exercises that translate from Greek to English, and the first 3 that translate from English to Greek, and then I'm going to leave it to you to do the rest of them. I think you'll find these are fairly straightforward. Here's the first one. Ekouomen tes phones autou, in akenais tais hemerais, nunda uketi, akouomen autes. We look at this and we notice that ekouomen seems a little strange when we first see it. We're not accustomed to seeing an eta at the beginning, but then we remember, oh yeah, this is the augment. The word was actually akouo, so we had to lengthen the alpha to an eta, and that's what's going on here. So it's ekouomen. We are putting the accent on the antepenult where it belongs. We translate this, we notice this is the first person plural ending, and so it's we were hearing. Remember that akouo can take the genitive, so it's going to be we were hearing, tes phones, the voice, autou, of him, or probably better, we were hearing his voice. En takes the dative, so we have the dative here. In akenais, those, tais hemerais, days, we were hearing his voice in those days, comma, nun da, but now. This word means now, and of course the postpositive da is a conjugation, means but. But now, uketi, no longer. Now notice here we have the present tense, so you notice these 2 words are identical except for the augment. That's how you're going to tell the difference. But now, no longer do we hear it. Autes has to, of course, agree with phones, so it is feminine. So we were hearing his voice in those days, but now no longer do we hear it. All right, let's look at the second. This reads, ho damathetes to kyriou elega parabolane tois adelphois autou. We look at this, of course, we're now familiar with this word mathetes. We know that's disciple. The ending tells us it's the nominative, singular. So ho, masculine article, ho de mathetes, but the disciple. Or very frequently when you have da right at the beginning of a sentence, you just don't mention it at all. It's just kind of there, but don't necessarily worry about it. So I'm just going to render it the disciple, to kyriou, of the Lord, elega, from lego, augment here, third person, singular. The disciple of the Lord was saying, parabolane, parable, we add the indefinite article, a parable, tois, dative, plural, masculine, to the adelphois, brothers, autou, of him. The disciple of the Lord was saying a parable to his brothers. And now the third, apektenon hoi douloi, ta tekna sun tois mathetais. Well, here's a new vocabulary word. It's apokteno, you know, means I kill. Kind of a violent sentence here, but Machen has to give it to us somehow. What I notice here is apokteno is a compound verb, and thus the omicron that was here is replaced by an epsilon, so the augment is put in there between the preposition here and the stem of the verb here. So it's apektenon. I also notice that the ending could be, of course, first person singular or third person plural, and I'm not sure which. So I'm going to look at the rest of the sentence to figure that out. But the one thing I do know is that omicron is always short, and the recessive rule wants to take the accent back as far as it can go to the antepenult, and so it's apektenon. The verb is apokteno, but now moving the accent back to the antepenult, apektenon. Now I'm looking around for a subject, and I see hoi douloi, the slaves. I notice it's in the nominative plural, and so that manifestly is the subject of the sentence. So it's going to read, the slaves, imperfect, were killing, ta, neuter plural, accusative, tekna, the children, sun, together with, tois, the mathetais, disciples. This is a masculine noun of the first declension, so we have the alpha here, even though there's an omicron there. So the slaves were killing the children together with, or with, the disciples. All right, well that hopefully is fairly straightforward. Let's shift our focus to the composition exercises. These are the exercises that go from English to Greek. The first one reads, the servant was saying these words against them. The servant or the slave, either one. So we start off with ho doulos. That should be very familiar to you now. The slave. We want to say was saying. We start with lego, and you recall that the third person is going to be lege, and that would be the slave is saying. But now you see I want the imperfect, so I just put an epsilon at the beginning of it. And I remember that the third person singular here, eluon, elus, elue, so I'm going to get rid of that, and I get elege. I notice this is short, so the accent is going to go back to that first syllable, to the antepenult, and hence we wind up with this lovely word, elege. The slave was saying these words, so it's tutus, tus, lagus. We've already talked about demonstrative pronouns, so that should make sense to you. Kata is the word for against when it's used with the genitive. Notice that because this begins with a vowel, we contract kata and make it kat with an apostrophe auton, against them. The slave was saying these words against them. All right, that was fairly straightforward, wasn't it? Let's take a look at the next one. This is number 2. According to the word of the apostle, they were going up into the temple. According to is again a form of the word kata, but now of course it comes with the accusative. So kata, I don't get rid of my alpha because this is a consonant, so kata, tone, logon. According to the word, tone, logon, to apostolu of the apostle, according to the word of the apostle. Oh, that's straightforward, isn't it? They were going up. This is anabino, but notice once again we insert the augment between the ana and the bino, so it's ane banan, and the ending is short, so the accent winds up here on the antepenult, and this is the ending for the third person plural, because that's what the sentence demands. They were going up. There's no named subject in this sentence, so we're just going to leave it with that rather indefinite personal pronoun they. So according to the word of the apostle, they were going up, ace ta heran, into, with the accusative, neuter, noun, heran, into the temple. Now the third of our exercises, fairly short, quite straightforward. The Lord was in his temple. So we look at our words here. Ho, kurios, the Lord, that's familiar to you. Here's the new word, ein. This is from, of course, the verb of being, me, I am, but it's in the imperfect, and it's the third person singular, so we conjugate it amen, ace, ein, third person. The Lord was, en, takes the dative, to, hiero, in the temple, and then autou, of him. The Lord was in his temple. So as I say, I think you'll find this chapter fairly straightforward. Once again, I'm encouraging you very strongly to work through the exercises. Believe me, you'll find the study of Greek much, much more enjoyable if you master each chapter as you go along. So this chapter is not all that difficult. I think you'll find that as you work through it, it makes sense. Again, I've provided to you the answers in the answer key that you can download and use to correct your work. And so go ahead and take your time, master this, and we'll get back together when you're ready for chapter 12. And until then, I just wish God's deepest blessing on you as you continue your studies of the Greek language, and we'll see you next time.